well. I see Lake 2 Land Aquanics. Is it Dutch? Wendy Hickson, Joseph Tevere, Mantronics, Item 13, 503, Menagerie, Laura Taylor, all here. Great to see you here. There's a velvet ant on the right there, over by the feeder. I'm going to change this to all messages visible. There we go. And we'll see if everybody can hear me. I hope you can. Paula Carroll and Ema XWLEL the Goat, Theropod Hunter, Chris's Critters. Great to see you here. Can you hear me? I just need confirmation. Okay, we have Item 13 and Laura Taylor both indicating they can hear me. It's great. Good to know. See, HS is here as well. This is an arid enclosure stream. It is based on a request from patrons, from a specific patron, in fact. Sandy's Aunt Sandy Skinks wanted to see the velvet ants. And this is the enclosure in which my velvet ants reside. I have 4 of them in here, and I'm not sure how many we'll see, but we just saw one of them for sure. And usually my Dasimutila clue guy is my boldest velvet ant, so we'll almost certainly see her again. I have 2 Dasimutila vistita in here, which we may or may not see, and then 1 small Timula, which we may or may not see. I've seen all of those 3 species recently, but the vistita and the Timula tend to be quite a bit shyer than the clue guy. So, all right, I see KJ22 and mildew also. Great. So I just put in some soaked dog food kibble and some jelly for the velvet ants and the beetles to come munch on. So that should bring them all to the yard, so to speak, pretty soon. And so I have quite a few Patreon questions, and I wanted to address those. I see Aunt Sandy Skinks is here, and thank you, Aunt Sandy, for the suggestion to view the velvet ant. That is why we are looking at this enclosure at the moment, and we will. There she is. She just ran by, velvet ant. And there's my Eleotis obscurus. We're going to see what we can see. Hopefully, there's a desert ironclad beetle in here. Well, they're the Asbolus verrucosus, which are sometimes called ironclad beetles, and then there is a true ironclad beetle in here as well, and some other death feigners of various types. Death feigner, blue death feigning beetle is probably the most common name for the Asbolus verrucosus, but it is sometimes called the ironclad beetle. They can be confusing, these common names. Let's see if the Eleotis obscurus goes for the dog food. I'm guessing so. And the blue death feigning beetles like it too, so we'll see. So here are some questions. Let's see, Theropod Hunter. Have I ever kept Prionotheca coronata? I have not. Oh, there she goes. The Eleotis going after the dog food. Let's zoom in just a bit. And there's my hide beetle in the bottom on the right there. It might go after the dog food as well. I'm just going to zoom in a little bit. And I wanted to address some questions. So we have the first question is from Ring Mango, first Patreon question, other than the velvet ant one that Aunt Sandy asked, and I'm already honoring that one. So Ring Mango asks, do you put any slime molds in your colonies of invertebrates? I've been thinking about putting some in my cultures. So just a little background, slime molds were once thought to be a fungus. They are now considered to be in the protist kingdom, which is sort of a catch-all for weird things that don't fit in others. But it is a very interesting organism because it is a type of communal colony that acts as one organism at certain states. So a slime mold, individual slime molds will form a colony, but that colony moves kind of like an organism. They're very cool. Hey, there is Mr. and Mrs. Morelia. Frank the Tank is here too. Kerns 28, Tennyson Kingsley. Excellent. So Tennyson, were you asking about the velvet ants, the white bristle velvet ants? I have kept 2 species of white bristle velvet ant, Dasimutilla gloriosa and Dasimutilla, let's see, which one? Nocturna, I believe, those 2. See, the velvet ant is actually digging in the dog food here. That is weird. I didn't expect to see that, but that's fun. So anyway, slime molds, back to slime molds. I have not purposefully introduced slime molds, or not intentionally introduced slime molds, is what I mean to say, um, into my enclosures. However, I have had slime molds in my dart frog enclosure, and and slime molds in some of my isopod enclosures. They are interesting. They tend to flow towards food. It's like the blob. They'll flow towards food and away from aversive stimuli and towards food and things like that. They're very interesting creatures, but I have never actually intentionally introduced them. I haven't seen any for a while. Ooh, I see that we have a super chat. Or I guess it's a super sticker from Wendy Hickson. Thank you so much for the donation. I appreciate that. Great way to get the stream started off right. Um, so hopefully that answers your question, Ring Mango. I don't have a lot to say about them because I've never done it intentionally, and they just kind of eventually reseeded on their own. But they are interesting. So Latoya McClellan, a new patron, asked, "Can you explain permits for shipping, and when do you consider a colony big enough to sell from?" Thanks so much. So the basics on permits. And I'm going to, let's see, what is the best way to do this? I guess what I'll do is, Latoya, I will put a link probably on Patreon to a video done by Pedro's Pods, all about this, and another video done by Wally of Supreme Gecko. Both patrons, both uh, very informative videos that will help you understand some more in detail. But I do want to address the questions, the basics of these questions. So the basics are: oh, here's a velvet ant eating some beetle jelly as over here, or some bug jelly, I guess, as the beetles eat the dog food. So that'll be fun to watch as we go. So the basics, you need to go. There's a new system to do it, the e-permit system. And if you look up USDA e-permits, you'll get to the right place. You need to create an account if you don't already have an account. And basically, it's a lot easier than it used to be. It'll guide you through the process of what you want to do. But basically, you'll look up the list of approved isopoda in that e-permit system, and you will basically apply for a state. And you can apply for a lot of states together as a group, and then you'll have to apply to some of them individually, and that changes over time which ones you need to do and so on. But most states you can apply as a group and just get a permit for it's about, I think it's 21 species of isopod nowadays, 21 species of isopod that are approved for interstate travel by by APHIS. And once you have done that, you typically, it's a good idea to apply for one, the first one, the kind of the group one for most of the states. And then once you've applied for that one, then you can apply for the other states individually. You can copy one permit and then just edit the states it's going to. And that's kind of how that works. Those are the basics, but more specific information, the best way to get it is to watch one of those videos, watch both of those videos actually. So I will link directly to those. And then let's address your other comment. When do you consider a colony big enough to sell from? It totally depends on so many factors, because it depends on the kind of species you're working with. It depends on, because some are more prolific than others, it also depends on how frequently you intend to sell from that colony. If you want a colony a robust colony that you can sell a lot from, you're going to need a much bigger colony to be able to sell from it frequently. But if you have like rubber duckies and say, well, once or twice a year, I'm just going to sell off a few extras so the colony doesn't get too big, then that could be a much smaller group of isopods than if you want to sell off so many more. But I would say, ideally, you'd probably want 200 to 300 isopods before you start selling. And if you did start selling with 200 to 300, it would be with the understanding you're not going to sell out of that colony very frequently, because you can quickly reduce the numbers to a point where you oversell. Like I had a big old 28 quart with just thousands of zebras in it, and I oversold from it, and I ended up having to wait, and so I'm still in the waiting phase. So it's possible to oversell. Zebras are just so popular. I can never have enough zebras. People always want them. So um, it really kind of depends on how often you're going to be selling and whether you're selling like from a business model. And then you'd probably want multiple cultures in any case, and you want bigger bins, and just you want the colonies to be reaching the point where you can sell. You have like 3 colonies of a given species, and you sell from one of the colonies until you get down to you only have a few hundred maybe, and then you go to rotate to colony B, sell off from that one, leave a few hundred in there, then rotate back to colony C, sell off, so you have only a few hundred in there, and then go back to colony A. And by the time you do, hopefully you'll have enough to start selling and that kind of thing. Um, but it really depends on how much production, how much um, you intend to sell off, and how dairy cows are so much more prolific than rubber duckies, for example. So you're going to be able to sell more sustainably from a large dairy cow culture than you would from a large rubber ducky culture. So I hope that makes sense. Uh, so I'm going to go to the next question comment here. This is from Sandy Sizemore. Aunt Sandy Skinks here. She says, best tips when starting a new culture, preventing molds, etc. Okay, a few things. You want to make sure that the new culture has some beneficial microorganisms in it. And there are various ways to do that. One way is to add some existing material from another enclosure. Like a tip I learned from Wally quite a while ago, and I've been doing for a long time, is taking some moss from an established isopod culture and adding it in some of the substrate too. I guess I did that even before I learned from Wally, but the substrate one. You take some substrate and moss from an existing culture and put it into the new culture to seed it. That helps add beneficial microorganisms as well as springtails. So say I want to start a rubber ducky culture and it's a fresh one, I would take moss and some of the substrate from my old rubber ducky culture, replace that with fresh stuff in the old culture, and use it to seed the new one. And then best of both worlds for both, because they're both getting the older culture is getting a refresh, the new culture is getting an infusion of these beneficial microorganisms, which can include fungi, bacteria, and springtails and other things. Um, Doing that can make a big difference towards getting it going. I wouldn't take, for example, a culture that has something like Silisticus convexus and take substrate from that and moss from that and put it into something that I'm going to keep Porcellio hoffmannseggi in, because I don't want the Porcellio hoffmannseggi to be infested with Silisticus convexus. I wouldn't do that. But if it's the same species, or I've even taken rubber ducky material from one of my rubber ducky cultures and put it in another culture, knowing that if I find 1 or 2 rubber duckies in the new culture, even if it's a different species, I'm not going to be too worried about it. And then I have, and I'll be like, oh, bonus, I found a rubber ducky today in my whatever culture. I take that out and put it back in the rubber duckies. So that's one way to do it. You can also buy commercial products that will help you do that. I know BioLives produces a product, the Bioactive starter. This right here. This is BioLives. And you just add a little bit of this powder to your substrate, and it has fungal spores and beneficial bacteria to help get things started. That's a nice thing to do, nice thing to use. Another tip is to make sure, if you can, you put the springtails in a few weeks before you put the isopods in, to allow them to gain a foothold in the enclosure before the isopods in. And here's another one that I think is perhaps not spoken of enough, and that is when you put the isopods in, don't start with a small count. People often start with a really small count. If you have the option of starting with a bigger count, please do. In a 6-quart tub, don't put a 6 count of isopods if you can avoid it. It would be better to start with a 30 count or 50 count or something like that in that enclosure. You just get a much quicker start, and you'll have fewer issues with pests in general, because it's kind of like this. If you have a big picnic outside in July, and the picnic is big enough, you have a spread that's big enough to feed 100 people, and you invite 6 people to it, you're going to have bugs all over that food at your picnic. You know what I mean? And that's just, there's nothing you can do to keep them all off. But if you invite 100 people into a 100 people spread, each one of those is going to be able to handle that food and eat it, and protect it from bugs and so on to some degree, and then you won't have so many problems with pests. And I kind of think of it that way. Um, so I hope that helps. Those are some of my tips that I've been thinking of. So Orang Mango also asked, can you talk about the ethics of collecting wild arthropods? Sure. Now, I think that there's a lot that goes into that, a lot of things to think about. And one, obviously, most of the arthropods that I keep are captive bred. I captive breed shrimp. I captive breed things like Daphnia and scuds. I captive breed, isopods. I captive breed so many of the arthropods that I keep. My jumping spiders are captive bred. I could go on. My one tarantula is captive bred. There's lots of creatures that I have that are captive bred, and the majority of them are. However, I do keep some creatures that are wild caught, and I think that is um, that can be okay, but we need to think about how we do it. Some things. Here's an example. Okay, there are some tarantula species in the hobby that can be bred, can be captive bred, are captive bred in pretty good numbers, and there's enough, there's enough of individuals in the hobby um, to sustainably captive breed them indefinitely. I don't believe that those tarantulas, those particular tarantula species that have large enough populations, uh, captive populations, and are breeding well in captivity, I don't believe those tarantula species should be collected regularly from the wild to be sold. Because it's just, why? If you already have them breeding and there's no reason to take them out of the wild. The reason why people do take them out of the wild in that case is, in some cases, they can get them more cheaply than they can captive bred, but I don't think that's a good idea. I do think that limited collection of that species, possibly for specific localities, in order to breed them and get captive populations going, um, or to add genetic diversity to the captive bred population, a few things like that to protect when you know a particular habitat locality is going to be rendered unsuitable for them, and you want to collect some to make sure that that locality has a chance to continue in captivity. That would be a good reason to collect some in the wild, but otherwise, just produce them in captivity. You know what I mean? Um, there are species of invertebrates that we're not regularly breeding in captivity, uh, but that we want to be. An example is the blue death feigning beetle right here. Not too long ago, breeding these in captivity was close to unheard of. It wasn't completely unheard of, but it was extremely rare. And then there were several people, and I wasn't the first one to do it, but I was one of the first people to breed blue death feigning beetles in captivity. And um, now many more people are doing it. And if we hadn't collected those from the wild, initially I didn't have access to any because I hadn't, there weren't any for me in a captive environment because none had been collected from the wild. I could not have bred them, and others could not have bred them, and we wouldn't be breeding them to the extent we're breeding them now. And I think there will come a time when we're still collecting them. We're still collecting them from the wild to some degree, but many more people are taking those and breeding them. And so I think that is okay as long as they're done in a sustainable yield. Some collected from the wild is okay, but we need to do that with an eye of, we also want to be increasing the breeding of these in captive environments from captive bred stock as much as possible. So if that makes sense. So we need that kind of thing going on. With velvet ants, we're not breeding them in captivity, and I think I have learned a few things about how to keep them better and how to keep them alive by keeping them. I don't keep large numbers of them because I don't think that's particularly sustainable to keep huge numbers of velvet ants. I'm not going to go out and collect huge numbers, but I do collect them in small numbers, and I think that's okay. Partly because I feel like part of my purpose in keeping them is to educate others. And there are many people I have, oh, sorry, I have to fix that. Many people I have taught, just one second as I adjust that. Is that the right light? Yeah, it is. Okay. Many people I have taught that velvet ants are not to be killed, based on my videos, based on presentations I've done, and so on. So now there are more people who know not to kill velvet ants. And I feel like I have to justify to some extent keeping them by helping other people understand how to take better care of them and help help people understand not to kill them, and then that kind of justifies what's going on. Uh, oh, I think people gifting memberships. That's awesome. Thank you. That's very cool. I love that. Membership is a new thing to me, and I'm figuring out how it works, but I really appreciate it. So I think collecting a certain amount of wild ones in order to increase our knowledge about them, especially with an eye to breeding them, is not a bad thing. If we're collecting them in huge numbers to just sell them willy-nilly and not get the breeding populations, I don't think that's great. Um, but the more we are learning about, um, so it doesn't necessarily mean like we need to think about numbers here. Like if we're collecting tens of thousands of a species and not breeding any of them and not making any effort to breed them at all in captivity, and it looks like we're going to be depleting them. That's of course awful if we're depleting them in the wild. But there are some things that can be collected in small numbers, and it's probably not going to be a big deal because there's not a huge demand for them. Like I love my flatty wall spider, and I think it would be cool to get those to breed in captivity. I think we should because I think they should be more popular. But if some are collected from the wild, like I collected mine from the wild, um, it's not going to be a huge impact. The numbers that are being collected from wild because they're relatively small and it's not going to be a problem. They're fairly common in the places where they live, and collecting a few from the wild isn't a big issue. But I think it would still be cool and a good idea to get them breeding in captivity. So hopefully that helps. That's sort of some generalizations out there, but it's kind of where I was aiming, I guess. And hopefully that helps. So Ring Mango, let me know what you think. Vance Goodwin has one too. He says, what do you currently keep bioactive and what species are you using for a cleanup crew in those enclosures? Okay, so when you say bioactive, I'm going to exclude aquatic environments for now, completely aquatic environments, because I do think those can qualify as bioactives, but I'm not going to get into that too much unless you want me to. And if you want me to go into the aquatics, let me know. I'm just looking around my room, bug room here, and getting some ideas. It also depends on what you mean by bioactive, because if you mean I have a substrate that has other creatures living in it, then this could count. We've got larvae living in here that are eating waste and they're eating things like that. So this might count as a bioactive to some extent. There are beetle larvae in there. If you count the eye spot enclosures with springtails in them and other things, then those could count too, and I've got loads of those. But as far as reptiles and amphibians, I've got a dart frog enclosure with a trio of Leucomelas dart frogs, Dendrobates leucomelas, the bumblebee dart frogs, with springtails and isopods and plants growing in there. I've got a leopard gecko enclosure that has currently superworms as the cleanup crew in there, and that works pretty well. We've got, okay, just looking around in my brain. In the other room, we've got a crested gecko enclosure, bioactive with isopods and springtails in it. Another crested gecko enclosure with isopods, springtails, and snails in it. Really small snails. I think they may be called garlic snails. We've got a couple of mourning gecko enclosures that I set up as bioactive. We've got a corn snake enclosure with isopods in it. No plants in the corn snake enclosure, but isopods doing their thing, springtails, and some beetles, some beetle larvae in there. I've got another three garter snake enclosures that are bioactive with different types of isopods, including one with Porcelaia dilatatus and a couple with Porcelaonides pruinosus. One of those 3 is planted currently. The other 2 I tried to plant and it didn't quite work, so I'm trying to figure out what's going on there. But the one is planted and doing well. Let's see. And I think that might be it for now in terms of bioactive that are not aquatic. And most of those have isopods and springtails of a different type. And I think I mentioned all the isopods. Dwarf whites in the crested gecko enclosures, and Porcelaia dilatatus and Porcelaonides pruinosus. And then springtails and everything. And I mentioned some other bugs I was using too. So hopefully that helps. And those are all the Patreon questions I had for this week, I think. Unless I missed something. It doesn't look like I missed anything. So there we go. Now I can focus a little bit more on the chat. Thank you, patrons, for all of your questions. Love it. Let's see. So 503, yeah. The flatty wall spiders are so cool. Flat Stanley is amazing, and just I'm not sure if Flat Stanley has done molting or not, but Flat Stanley has molted like 4 times or something in my care, gotten quite big. Just fascinating to watch, easy to care for, love it. I think it's a species that should be in the hobby. So ABC Death, is it safe for isopoding carnivorous plants terrarium? I think some of the isopods would be eaten. Oh, I just got another Patreon question that popped up just now. That one's from Alina. And let's see. That's not showing up in my feed though. That's weird. I saw it and then it disappeared. Okay, well, it said, what's the difference between Porcelaia and Porcelaonides? Well, there are a lot of, I guess, anatomical differences that you'd have to, I'm not even fully aware of what all the anatomical differences are, but in terms of just looking at them and seeing them from their appearance, Porcelio, there's a lot of variety in Porcelaia. We have fewer Porcelaonides in the hobby. The mainstays of the hobby are Porcelaonides pruinosus, Porcelaonides florea, which is less common. So all the powders that we're familiar with are pruinosus or maybe hybrids of that in florea. Florea is also in the hobby, but is less common. Has like antennae with alternating bands of color on it. I think that's the biggest difference that's visible. And they tend to look otherwise like the wild types of Porcelaonides pruinosus. So then there's Porcelaonides virgatus, which is probably not actually in that genus, but it is considered to be in that genus right now. Virgatus is considered Porcelaonides, and it's quite a bit different. But it seems more similar to Porcelio from what I heard recently from somebody. I think it was Kyle Candillian was mentioning that. So let's see. Trying to think about it. When you look at Porcelaonides, at least the pruinosus and florea, they have a very velvety texture to them in many situations. And I would say that Porcelio doesn't tend to have that waxy, velvety sort of coating. Some are very smooth, some have tubercules or little bumps on them, depending on the species, like scaber. Scaber means rough and they have bumps on them. Dilatatus has bumps on them. Laevis tends to be more smooth. So there's a lot going on there. A lot of variety in Porcelio. Many of the Porcelio tend to be broader than Porcelaonides in their body shape. Porcelaonides tends to move faster and is smaller than most of the Porcelio in the hobby as well. So hopefully that gives you some idea, Alina, of some differences. And hopefully that's the level of detail that you were looking for. So red lily dragon, as far as blue death feigning beetles having babies, getting the larvae to grow, it's generally very easy to get them to lay eggs, and the eggs will hatch as long as there's some moisture in the substrate. Keeping a moisture gradient, you want there to be lots of ventilation, you want most of the substrate to be dry, but you want a moist area all the time in the enclosure, at least under the surface. You want it to be moist, and that will be based partly on the temperature, or no temperature, well, partly that too, but the type of substrate you have. Having an area where there is always moist that they can get to seems to be helpful in getting the larvae to grow. So Chris's critters, have you tried Porcellonides pruinosus in the leopard gecko? That's the species I've had most success with leopard geckos. So the longer black shiny beetle in there, I'm not sure which species that is. That was one that came from my adventures, Sky Island Adventures this past summer, and I don't recall the species. I think I've known it at one point, but I don't remember quite which one it is. So Luch is asking about, do I have any large beetles? Not any larger than the ones in this enclosure. Ooh, I just got a super chat from item 13. Thank you for the jelly and dog food fund. Much appreciated. It does take some funds to take care of all these creatures, so very much appreciated. Thank you, item 13. Chris is saying not yet. You have a very small culture. You have a culture, but it's very small. Okay. Yeah, that's true, 503. The Dilatatus are fairly dry tolerant and they might get eaten, but they tend to be more fossorial than the dairy cows do, and so they might have a better chance. So that is a good suggestion too. Welcome, Sultan. And rare reply mouth? Rare Plymouth? Sorry, I'm trying to parse that name. Rare Plymouth, maybe. See, my box turtle love beetles, but my hubby gets upset when they eat one of the beetles. Ah, because your husband likes the beetles? Is that why? Or is there a different reason? So 503, yeah, the ironclad, the diabolical ironclad beetles really seem to eat almost everything that I put in here. They do like the fungus. They really like the kinshi from Bugs in Cyberspace. It's been a while since I've had some of that. I need to put some more in. But yeah, they are a fungal. They seem to specialize in fungus in the wild. So that's not surprising that you find that they like mushrooms. I think I've given mine some mushrooms too. But I would say I should probably offer mushrooms more often. But they'll eat almost anything I put in here. So Tyler Martin, what do you recommend keeping with Florida bark scorpions and horrid assassins? So let's see. I've never kept Florida bark scorpions. I've kept a few scorpion species. I have a couple scorpion species now, but I'm not sure what I would put with them in terms of a cleanup crew. Maybe something small like the dwarf purples, something like that. And then horrid assassins. I know that when I did a video on horrid assassins, it was a collaboration video with bugeaters.co, and he said he had, I think he put giant canyons in with his king assassins, but I have never kept mine, kept that species myself, so I'm not sure what to tell you on that. Um, but I think that's the species that he used with them. Let's see if I can zoom in on some of these bugs here, huh? There is the diabolical ironclad beetle. This one I've had for quite a few years. I'm not even sure how long I've had it. It came from Bugs in Cyberspace. Many of these beetles did, not all of them, but many of them did. And it's been really, really cool to watch it. Just seems to be thriving. So rare Plymouth, yeah. The blue death fainting bills are pretty awesome. He would be probably over the moon if you got him some of those. And you could get a breeding colony going, hopefully. It's a lot of fun. This particular velvet ant that you see in the shot munching on beetle jelly, This was one I found locally, and well, not locally. It's in my state, so I guess relatively locally, but it's about 3 hours drive from here, down in the south in the summer. This particular one seemed to be at risk from getting stomped because it was on a road near. It was a viewing area, and some people were viewing, and I heard someone say, "Oh, what's that?" And someone else said, "It's a bug." And I looked over, and they were like 70 feet away, and I saw something crawling on the ground, and it looked just like a velvet ant crawling. Even from that distance, I could see it on the road, and so I ran over there and picked it up, and decided I wasn't necessarily going to take it home, but then I realized that there were velvet ants all over the place. It was crawling with velvet ants, that area, the species of velvet ant. They were all over. So I felt like, okay, if I bring one home, it's not the end of the world. Sustainable yield. They were kind of curious to see me doing what I was doing. And someone earlier asked in the stream if I handled the velvet ants. Um, Well, I handled this one, free-handled it when I collected it. I tend not to do that with velvet ants. They can sting. I have been stung. It's not fun. But the only time I got stung when I was 10 years old and I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't have one as a pet. It stung me because I was messing with it too much, and it was quite painful. But it didn't dissuade me from being fascinated by velvet ants. In fact, it probably just increased my fascination. I'm much more careful when I handle velvet ants now, but I usually only capture them with that kind of situation. I have had them with my hands in the enclosure, once in a while, or I'm moving one, they'll crawl in my hand, and I have never been stung when I keep them as a pet. So, Chris Critters, you found a false bombardier beetle. Glad to hear it's thriving in with a leopard gecko. With a real bombardier beetle, you probably wouldn't want to put one in there because you could subject your leopard gecko to some pretty uncomfortable situations. But okay. So rare Plymouth is busy growing ice pod collection of beetles are superworms and mealworms that didn't get eaten by my boxies. Okay, yeah, that makes sense. And I have those too. I actually find both of them quite interesting to keep. They make great pets. They're fun to watch. Have you ever put plants in your desert tank? So Ring Mingo says, not in this one. Thought about putting something in here. I feel like the substrate's not ideal for it, uh, but I've thought about it. I may eventually do that. Some succulents of some type or cacti of some kind. So rare Plymouth. Where do you recommend getting the blue deathwing beetles? Well, Bugs in Cyberspace is a good place. Um, they're very responsible about how they collect and so on, and they have helped spread the information about how to reproduce them, and so that they can get people doing that in captivity as well. So I would say Bugs in Cyberspace is a great place to get them. Oh, thank you, Frank the Tank. Put the link to Bugs in Cyberspace right there. Awesome. Thank you, Frank. So Chris GZ, we're looking at a velvet ant, Dasimutilla klugii, and we're looking at an Asbolus verrucosus. And what else is visible right now? I don't know if you can see my hide beetle. I can't remember the genus name for the hide beetle that's on the left side of the feeding tray right there. And then we've got several other beetles, some tenebrionids and so on of various types over here. One of them's dragging a piece of dog food around, it pulled out of the food dish. Okay, Ring Mingo says, Tillandsia usually works well in my desert tanks if soil is a no-go. Interesting. I have thought about, well, I have some Tillandsias. Like here is, I have some Tillandsias. Here's one that I've had for about a year. Well, one. The parent plant on the right and the pup on the left. I've had these about a year. They seem to be doing really well. I have a couple more. Some that Chris, not Chris, who was it? Charlie Moorcroft, who sent me some uh, recently. And that one that he sent is starting to do well. This one looks a little bit darker here. There's another one that pupped for me. Uh, this one flowered. You can see the remnants of the flower there. And then here's a pup. And then the one that Charles Moorcroft sent me right here. I think this one is the species known as ball moss. You can see it's starting to grow. It's a fairly recent one. Oh, so Schonmeister, I said hide beetles, Hide, which is not the same as, some of the dermestids have been referred to as that in that way too, but that's not what we're talking about here. But the species is known as, or the group is known as hide beetles as well, I believe. Let's see. Oh, see, I think, Frank, to take a substrate with blue death feigners of around 10 to 12 inches to see how that did. I think that would be awesome, to see what you could get in terms of breeding. That would be pretty fantastic, wouldn't it? And there comes the diabolical ironclad beetle trundling along. I don't know if it's going to partake of the chow or not. You see that velvet ant is just going to town on that food. She was drinking from these nectar wells, the nectar bottles, whatever, nectar feeders, whatever you want to call them, on the right here, drinking from those just right before the stream started. I thought, oh, maybe we won't get her to eat because she's going to have satiated herself on the nectar feeders. But here she is, going after the nectar. You can see her munching away, licking it. I guess would be more appropriate than munching. But yeah, she's doing her thing. She's enjoying it, it appears. Okay, so Malo86. My son recently got some hissing roaches. What do you say about putting backyard isopods straight into their enclosure? Well, a couple of things. From what I understand, and I must say I have limited experience with roaches. I have kept some. I've never bred them, and I've never had any. I've never kept any in my own home, so I have some limited knowledge there. But from what I understand is that isopods often do well in with hissers, and so you might have some success there, but there is some risk of introducing something else along with wild caught isopods if you just bring them from outside, especially if you bring them along with soil or something else you brought from outside. You could potentially introduce something that you didn't want into that enclosure, and that could be some grain mites. It could be some nematode worms or something. There could be various things you could introduce in there. Some of them might not be harmful. They might just be kind of frustrating hitchhikers to deal with, and some might potentially be harmful. But so you could introduce something like that in using wild-caught isopods, and then wild-caught isopods will sequester heavy metals in their exoskeletons in certain cases when they're exposed to large numbers of them, and large quantities of the heavy metals. And I don't know that just adding a handful of isopods from outside would be a significant amount of those, but you could potentially be introducing toxins like that, or pesticides if they had been exposed to pesticides and then you put them in your enclosure. Again, a handful of isopods probably wouldn't have been exposed to a huge number of pesticides, but if they happened to have walked through an area that was saturated with pesticides shortly before you collected them, and then you put them with your hissers, that could potentially be an issue. Putting captive bred isopods in there, you would basically reduce those risks to nearly zero in any of those things happening. So that would be a better option, I think. But then again, you might introduce wild ones and find that none of those things happen, and you'd be okay. So um, I just generally say that if you're going to introduce wild caught isopods into anything, rather than do that, collect the wild caught isopods, breed them for a generation or so, and then if you see any pests in that enclosure, you can try to deal with that before you end up introducing those to whatever enclosure you want to put them in. So Sean Meister is asking the ratio of water and sugar for the nectar feeder. We use 6 parts water to 1 part sugar, and then I add a tiny, tiny bit of salt just for some electrolytes. That's our ratio. Good question. I bought those feeders. The company is called Biformica. I think there's a space, BY space FORMICA, and they sell them on Amazon, and that's where I bought them. There, you can see I have a third one. I have 2 with nectar and 1 with water. And the beetles go to them as well as the velvet ants. They're pretty nice to have. Let's see. So Chris's critters, let me know how the Armadillidium gestura do with the bromeliads. We know that um, bromeliads, I'm sorry, bromeliads, Armadillidium can nibble on plants, and I would be interested to see how they do with the bromeliads. Would love to know about that. So Chris's critters, there are nematodes that can be harmful to isopods, yes, and there are other nematodes that are not. My understanding is that they did a study with the type of nematodes that can control fungus gnats. Hopefully I'm remembering this correctly. And when those are introduced to an enclosure with isopods to control the fungus gnats, the nematodes can sometimes harm the isopods. So that could be an issue. There are free-living nematodes that are completely harmless to isopods as well. But there are lots of different nematodes out there. So okay, so rare Plymouth, I think the 1/3 dry, 1/3 wet, 2/3 dry for your clown isopods, Armadillidium klugi, that is a pretty good ratio. You could do 3 parts dry to 1 part wet as well, but somewhere in there is a sweet spot. I think you're fine where you are right now. Yeah, so Schonmeister, that's what I'm trying to do, getting close to what flower nectar is like. LF, welcome. Glad you joined the live. So rare Plymouth. So the moisture, you're thinking about using these for hydrating which creature? Okay, let's see. So do you have to change mesh in the nectar containers, or does it stay pretty clean? Um, Maybe there's an autocorrect issue there. I'm not sure, but there isn't really a mesh per se. There is kind of depending on the model. There's 3 different models here. There's just like wells here that the way they're built, they get filled up and the liquid collects there. This one has kind of like a 3D printed membrane, for lack of a better word, between it and everything else, but it still seems to work. And then this other one is built like the small one, in that there's not really a mesh or a membrane. It is a good idea to change up. It's a good idea, first of all, with the ones that actually have nectar in them, to shake them around a little bit to mix up the nectar, because the sugar part in the solutions tends to settle a little bit. So you jiggle it around a little bit, do that, and then I try to change these at least once a week. It seems important to do that so it doesn't get too icky. Um, Something like that, about once a week. Theropod hunter, what is the arid millipede species? Well, there's Orthoporus. The genus Orthoporus is a desert millipede. To say it's an arid millipede is a little bit misleading, just because, not to say that you're trying to be misleading. What I mean is, I wouldn't necessarily call it an arid millipede just because the microhabitats they seek out aren't completely dry most of the time. They tend to come out when it's raining and then retreat underground where there's some moisture and so on. But you see what I mean? So, but the Orthoporus genus is common in deserts. I was able to see my first wild Orthoporus species in uh, southern Arizona with Sky Island Adventures this past summer. It was pretty awesome. First time I'd ever seen them in the wild. I've seen many millipedes in the wild, but not Orthoporus until then. Yeah, if you have nematodes in your enclosure already, Chris, it is super difficult to completely eliminate them. Um, so yeah, I don't know if you're even going to be able to do that, but they are most likely just free living nematodes that aren't going to be a big deal. So Lord Shade 67, yeah, I got into isopods a long time ago. I want to say it was around 2013-ish. Could be Perhaps it was a little before that, I'm not sure. Right around there though, because I started to set up a bioactive enclosure for geckos and got into isopods because of that. An imaginary eye, yeah. In fact, velvet ants, you're right. There are over 30 species. In fact, there are more than there are around 8,000 species of velvet ant. Frank the Tank, I do have some harvestmen. I have Libitioides sayi. Yeah, Laura Taylor, I think these would be it would be appropriate to compare these to a chicken watering bowl and how they work. Yeah, that makes sense. I wonder if I can grab one of my harvestmen, show it off here. Well, not grab. That's an inappropriate term to use in this situation because grabbing it would be unpleasant for it. But if I can coax it, perhaps that would be a better term. And ideally, not even handle it, just pick up a piece of a structure upon which it is resting and then share it that way. That would be ideal. There's one right there. See, I don't know if the lighting's going to be good enough. We're going to try though. I'm going to adjust the lighting here with my flashlight. I think that will help. There's my Libitioides sayi. Pretty cool little harvestman, huh? I like these. I'm hoping I can get them breeding again in the spring. I have heard that they reproduce better with a diapause, with some cooling, and they're definitely getting a little bit cooler in here in the winter. So hopefully we get them breeding again. And Frank the Tank, that's what I've heard, that they're working on the Bidioides albulineata or something like that. Or they're not quite sure if it's a species or if it's just like a locality difference or something. So they're working on that. But yeah, it may be albulineata and it may not. I think it's still, the jury's still out. And so Chris's critters, the harvestmen, seem to do pretty well. They like fruit flies, like live flightless fruit flies. So I put those in. But they also eat things like dog food, fish food. I learned from uh, Kyle at Roach Crossing that fluval bug bites, which are a fish food, are an excellent food for harvestmen. I'm actually think of getting some of the Sinusoides, I think is the genus name, of one of the harvestmen that seem to do, they almost entirely, they can do just fine on a diet of nothing but the fluval bug bites. And that seems like a really great way to go because the Libitioides seem to like some live food, which is great. I can give them plenty of fruit flies. I always have flightless fruit flies around, but it's just, it can be hard to remember to give them enough of them to keep them breeding. But with something like the fluval bug bites, if that can be their main diet and I just throw some fruit flights in there for variety once in a while, that would be really easy to do. Well, we're definitely getting a good view of this velvet ant. So I hope Sandy got a good chance to look at her. I'm sorry the other velvet ants have not shown themselves this evening, but at least we have this one. And 503, very true. I should have mentioned that. The is it the first or the second ingredient? I think it's the first ingredient. Yeah, the first ingredient is indeed the black soldier fly larvae. Let's see if that shows up here on the container. Dried black soldier fly larvae, and then salmon, fish protein concentrate, green peas, potato, wheat, all these other things. But yeah, that is the main ingredient. So that seems to be a good food for them. So I'm sorry if I kind of lost a lot of the chat at the beginning. I missed it. I was answering Patron questions, which is great. But if I missed something that you wanted me to talk about, I have just a couple more minutes. I have about 5 more minutes before I need to go. So we can. I'm happy to answer some more questions if you got them. I'm going to try to detach this from the tripod so that I can get in here and see some things a little bit differently. Like here's the hide beetle. It is munching on the food, but you can see it moving around a little bit as it munches on the food. Can we see the tarantula? I'm trying to figure out if I can make that work right now. That would be awesome. I'm just not sure if I can make it work right now logistically. Let's see, what do we got going on over here? So which species do you have with your beardy, Lord Shade? I've heard people doing like dairy cows in with beardies and having good success with the all-important hydration station, like you mentioned. There's a little congregation of a few little the death fanny beetles back there. 3 of them. So do you not have any native ant lions there, Pod Hunter? Is it just not dry enough or something? We get ant lions here. I had one metamorphosis once when I was a kid, and I've collected a few more and had them for a while, and I never got them to metamorphose. So I've pretty much stopped keeping them because I couldn't get them to do their thing. I have young men interested in predators for powders. Any thoughts? They're great food for a lot of small reptiles and amphibians. Is that the kind of thing you meant, or a predator you would put in the enclosure with the powders? Yeah, tons of small reptiles and amphibians will eat the powders. Great food for newts, for small frogs, for um, little geckos, all kinds of things. Well, there's the diabolical ironclad beetle again. Here's one of those long-bodied tenebrionids. Oh, Lord Shade, Armadillidium vulgare. Yeah, they're actually, some of them, especially certain localities, are pretty resistant to dryness as long as they have their long as they have their moist area. All right. Well, if everybody can drop me a like, if you haven't already, we have 41 likes and 48 people in the stream. A like spike right now would be great as we top off the stream here. Who wants to go total bioactive with a predator on the powders? Oh, okay. Yeah. One of those reptiles or amphibians could be great then. You might also try an isopod hunting spider, a Dysdera crocata. Oh, there is a native sundew in the UK. That's pretty cool. All right, everyone. We did get a bit of a like spike there. Appreciate that. Appreciate the super chats. Appreciate just everybody chiming in, joining in. Appreciate the patrons for their questions, which help drive the beginning part of the stream. That's awesome. Hopefully you enjoyed viewing my desert communal that includes beetles as well as these beautiful fuzzy wingless wasps. Um, so here we go. It's about time to wrap up. I hope you all have a good one, and I have an isopod themed video coming out on Friday, so keep your eyes open for that. Appreciate you all joining in. Take care, everybody.